documents in the FBI's possession?
They reviewed all that, yes, sir.
And so have you reviewed those 302 documents where the victims name the people who victimized them?
If I personally know, but the FBI has.
So how can you sit here and in front of the Senate and say there are no names?
I said
I named one today.
I said we are not in the practice at the Department of Justice FBI of releasing victims' names. That is not what we do. We are also not in the habit of releasing incredible information. That's not what we do. But multiple authorities have looked at the entirety of what we have.
Okay, I got to move on here. Were you present when the AG had the White House event when she released the binders to the social media influencers?
I was, yes.
So if you're willing to meet with social media influencers who stood to benefit from the sensational and sad stories of these victims, will you meet with the victims as well?
The FBI will meet with anyone who has new information.
Will you personally meet with them?
The FBI and the professionals who are handling the cases will.
Were you instructed that it was important to release the documents to the Oversight Committee on the day of my introduction of the discharge petition to release these files?
I don't know what day that was, so no.
Well, they were released that day, and there were victims' names who weren't redacted because they were in such a rush, and the victims are not happy about that. Have you investigated any of the CIA connections? Have you seen the CIA file on Jeffrey Epstein? And if you wanted to see it, would they show it to you?
Well, I can speak for the FBI, and that's presuming there's a CIA case file. And I've reviewed everything that the interagency, not I, the FBI, that was provided to us.
Would you be willing to look at the CIA file on Jeffrey Epstein?
If there is such a file, and if it has not already been turned over to the FBI will look at any new investigative leads.
Let me tell you about a moment that just happened in Congress that perfectly captures why so many Americans feel like they're being gaslit about the Epstein files. Thomas Massie stood up during a live hearing and did something that shouldn't be controversial, but somehow has become explosive. He read names from FBI documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein, laid out a clear timeline of investigations, and asked the FBI director one devastatingly simple question. Have you actually reviewed everything? And the answer he got back was so carefully worded, so deliberately evasive, that it revealed more through what wasn't said than what was. This wasn't some conspiracy theory rant. This wasn't Massie throwing out wild accusations or demanding arrests based on internet rumors. This was a methodical, documented presentation of official records, and it exposed a massive gap between what the public has been told and what actually exists in government files. We're not talking about speculation here. We're talking about formal FBI interview documents that detail allegations from victims who cooperated with federal investigations. And those documents are sitting there, reviewed by some people but apparently not by others, while the American people are told there's nothing to see. Massie started by introducing 4 separate documents into the congressional record. The first was an article about how Epstein's operation played out for years in plain sight, including a quote from a prosecutor named Acosta who said he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Just let that sink in for a second. A federal prosecutor was allegedly told that a man running a sex trafficking operation had intelligence connections and should be left alone. The second document Massie introduced was about Epstein's bodyguard warning about CIA connections. The third detailed Epstein's private calendar showing planned meetings with an Obama administration official and a CIA chief. The fourth was a Wall Street Journal piece, highlighting that Ehud Barak, the former Prime Minister of Israel and head of military intelligence, had 36 meetings with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Massie wasn't claiming these documents prove anything definitively. He was establishing context, showing that intelligence agency connections to Epstein aren't some fringe theory cooked up on obscure websites. These are mainstream news reports, documented meetings, statements from officials involved in the cases. This is the foundation he needed to lay before asking his real questions, because what came next was even more damning. Another congressman jumped in to add to the record a judge's decision from a case that mentioned the government has 100,000 pages of Epstein files. Not 100 pages, not 1,000, 100,000 pages. That's not a case file, that's an archive. That's documentation of something so extensive, so thoroughly investigated, that it dwarfs almost any other case you can think of. And yet we're supposed to believe that somehow, despite all that material, there's nothing actionable, nothing that leads anywhere, no one else who should be held accountable. Then Massie turned directly to FBI Director Kash Patel and brought up something Patel said during his Senate hearing the day before. When Senator Kennedy asked him about the Epstein files and whether anyone else was involved in trafficking these women, Patel replied that there was no credible information showing Epstein trafficked victims to anyone besides himself. That's the official line. Epstein acted alone. Nobody else was involved. Case closed. But Massie wasn't buying it, and he had receipts. Patel had also claimed during his testimony that the problem with the Epstein investigation was that it was hamstrung by limited search warrants from 2006 and 2007, and by a non-prosecution agreement that prevented future investigations. And here's where Massie dropped the hammer. Those constraints only applied to the Southern District of Florida. They don't apply to the Southern District of New York, which is where the 2019 sex trafficking indictment was filed, the one that produced thousands of pages of new evidence, including a series of FD 302 documents. Those are formal FBI interview summaries, the kind of documentation that gets created when witnesses cooperate with federal investigators. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. According to victims who worked with the FBI during that New York investigation, those 302 documents detail at least 20 men that Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims to. Massie named one of them publicly, Jess Staley, the former CEO of Barclays Bank. But there are 19 others in those files. Massie didn't have all their names, but he described who they are based on what's documented. One Hollywood producer worth hundreds of millions of dollars, one royal prince, one high-profile individual in the music industry, one very prominent banker, one high-profile government official, one high-profile former politician, one owner of a car company in Italy, one rock star, one magician, at least 6 billionaires including one from Canada. These aren't random accusations from unreliable sources. These are descriptions of people identified in FBI documents by victims, including minors like Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who Massie mentioned by name before saying, "May she rest in peace." These victims cooperated with federal investigators. They gave detailed accounts. Those accounts were documented in official FBI records, and those records exist right now in FBI possession. Massie made that crystal clear. We know these people exist in the FBI files, the files that you control. The FBI knows exactly who they are. So why hasn't anyone been charged? Patel's response was revealing in what it avoided. He said it wasn't his assertion that the victims weren't credible, but rather the assertion of 2 different United States attorneys' offices across 3 separate administrations who investigated the same materials. This is a classic bureaucratic dodge. Spread the responsibility across so many people and so much time that accountability becomes impossible to pin down. Nobody made the decision not to prosecute because everybody made that decision collectively across different offices and different years, which somehow means nobody can be held responsible for it. Massie pressed harder. Are the 302 documents in the FBI's possession? Yes, Patel confirmed. Have you reviewed those documents where victims name the people who victimized them? Patel's answer was stunning. If I personally know, but the FBI has. Think about what that means. The FBI director, the person ultimately responsible for the Bureau's investigations, hasn't personally reviewed the documents at the heart of one of the most high-profile cases in recent history. He's relying on others who reviewed them, others who made decisions not to prosecute, others who determined that somehow none of this was actionable despite victims naming specific powerful individuals. Massie called him out directly. How can you sit in front of the Senate and say there are no names when I just named one today? And Patel's response reveals the game being played here. He said the FBI isn't in the practice of releasing victims' names, which is true and appropriate. But Massie wasn't asking for victims' names. He was asking about the names of alleged perpetrators identified by those victims. Patel conflated the two to avoid answering the actual question. Then, the hearing took an even more interesting turn. Massie asked Patel if he was present when the Attorney General held a White House event where she released binders of Epstein material to social media influencers. Patel confirmed he was there. So Massie hit him with a devastating question. If you're willing to meet with social media influencers who stood to benefit from the sensational and sad stories of these victims, will you meet with the victims themselves? Will you personally meet with them? Patel's answer was another dodge. The FBI will meet with anyone who has information, he said. The professionals handling the cases will meet with them. But he wouldn't commit to personally meeting with victims, even though he personally attended a media event designed to control the narrative around the document release. That tells you everything about the priorities here. Victims are kept at arm's length while influencers get FaceTime and documents. It's not about justice or truth, it's about managing public perception. Massie then revealed something infuriating. The documents were released to the Congressional Oversight Committee on the same day he introduced a discharge petition to force their release. And because they were rushed out so quickly to preempt his petition, victims' names weren't properly redacted. The very people who suffered abuse had their privacy violated again because the administration was more concerned with controlling when and how the information came out than with protecting the people who deserved protection. And those victims are not happy about it, Massie noted. Of course they're not. They've been used and abused by Epstein and his associates, and now they're being used again by a government more interested in optics than accountability. Then came perhaps the most important questions of the entire hearing. Massie asked if Patel had investigated any of the CIA connections to Epstein. Have you seen the CIA file on Jeffrey Epstein? And if you wanted to see it, would they show it to you? Patel's answer was carefully conditional. He said, presuming there's a CIA case file, he's reviewed everything that the interagency provided to the FBI. That's not the same as saying he's seen everything that exists. It's saying he's seen what was shared with him. When Massie pressed whether Patel would be willing to look at the CIA file on Epstein, the answer was even more conditional. If there is such a file, and if it has not already been turned over to the FBI, then the FBI would look at any new investigative leads. Those are a lot of ifs, and they reveal that even now, even with all the public pressure and congressional oversight, there's no definitive confirmation that every relevant file from every relevant agency has been examined. We're still operating in a world of maybes and conditional statements when it comes to intelligence agency connections to one of the most notorious criminals in recent history. This is where the whole thing falls apart for anyone paying attention. We have 100,000 pages of documents. We have FBI interview summaries identifying at least 20 men by description, if not by name. We have victims who cooperated with investigators and told their stories. We have calendar entries showing meetings with intelligence officials. We have prosecutors saying they were told to back off because of Epstein's connections. We have multiple investigations across multiple jurisdictions spanning multiple administrations, and somehow, at the end of all of that, the official story is that Epstein acted alone, and there's no credible evidence of anyone else being involved. That doesn't add up. It doesn't pass the most basic smell test. When you have victims naming names, when those names are documented in FBI files, when those files describe Hollywood producers and royal princes and billionaires and government officials, you can't simultaneously claim there's no credible information about other perpetrators. What you can say is that prosecutors decided not to charge anyone else. You can say that standards of evidence weren't met. You can say that plea deals and non-prosecution agreements created legal obstacles. But you cannot say the information doesn't exist when a congressman is literally reading descriptions of it from official documents into the congressional record. Massie's questioning exposed something crucial about how these investigations work and why the public has lost faith in them. When responsibility gets spread across multiple offices, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple administrations, accountability becomes impossible. Everyone can point to someone else and say they made the decision. The Southern District of Florida blames the search warrants and the non-prosecution agreement. The Southern District of New York apparently reviewed everything and decided not to charge anyone despite having all those 302s. The FBI says prosecutors made the calls. Prosecutors say the FBI's investigation didn't produce enough. Intelligence agencies apparently have files that may or may not have been shared with the FBI, and the current FBI director hasn't even personally reviewed the victim interview documents at the center of it all. This is bureaucracy being weaponized to prevent accountability. It's not that any one person or office is necessarily corrupt or compromised, though that's certainly possible. It's that the system is designed in a way that allows responsibility to dissolve into a fog of jurisdictional complexity and institutional layers. By the time you've tracked down who made which decision and why, years have passed, administrations have changed, and everyone involved can claim they were just following procedures established by someone else somewhere else. What makes this particularly galling is the contrast Massie highlighted between how victims are treated versus how the media spectacle is managed. The government will stage events for social media influencers. They'll release documents strategically timed to blunt congressional oversight efforts. They'll carefully manage what information comes out, when, and in what form. But they won't personally engage with the survivors who actually lived through this nightmare. Those people get referred to professionals and processes while influencers get meetings with the Attorney General and the FBI Director. That reveals what the priority actually is here. It's not about getting justice for victims. It's not about ensuring that everyone who participated in these crimes faces consequences. It's about managing the narrative, controlling what the public knows and when they know it, and making sure that powerful people who might be implicated stay protected behind walls of procedural complexity and prosecutorial discretion. The questions about intelligence agency involvement add another disturbing dimension. If Epstein had CIA connections, if he was being protected because of those connections, if files exist in intelligence agencies that haven't been fully shared with law enforcement, then we're not just talking about a failure to prosecute. We're talking about a deliberate decision to shield a sex trafficker because he was useful to someone in the intelligence community. That would mean victims were sacrificed for whatever operational benefit Epstein provided. That would mean the government knowingly allowed abuse to continue because they valued Epstein's connections or information more than they valued the children and young women he was trafficking. Patel's conditional answers don't rule that out. He doesn't say categorically that there's no CIA file. He doesn't say that every intelligence file has been reviewed and found to contain nothing relevant. He says if such files exist and if they haven't been shared, then maybe someone would look at them. That's not reassuring. That's terrifying. Because it means even now, years after Epstein's death, there could be files sitting in intelligence agencies that have never been examined by the people investigating his crimes. Massie ended his questioning by bringing up two other cases, the January 6th pipe bombs and the Las Vegas shooter's motive. Patel said the pipe bomb investigation is ongoing and they've made progress, and that he'd have to get back to Massie about the Las Vegas shooter. Those questions might seem random, but they're not. Massie was highlighting a pattern. These are high-profile cases where the public has never gotten satisfactory answers, where investigations seem to stall or produce incomplete conclusions, where we're told to trust that everything possible was done, but the results never quite make sense. What this hearing revealed isn't proof of specific crimes by specific people. What it revealed is a system that doesn't work the way we're told it works. We're told that when victims come forward and cooperate with investigators, justice follows. But here we have victims who did exactly that, whose statements are documented in FBI files, who identified powerful people by name and description, and nothing happened. We're told that federal investigations are thorough and follow the evidence wherever it leads. But here we have an FBI director who hasn't personally reviewed the key documents in one of the most important cases imaginable. We're told that transparency and accountability are priorities. But here we have documents released in a rushed, sloppy way that violated victims' privacy just to preempt congressional oversight. The 100,000 pages of documents are particularly haunting. Think about what that represents. That's not a simple case. That's evidence of a massive, long-running operation with connections to powerful people in multiple countries across multiple industries. That's documentation of abuse on a scale that should have resulted in dozens of arrests and prosecutions. Instead, we got Epstein himself, who died in custody under suspicious circumstances, and Ghislaine Maxwell, who got 20 years. Everyone else apparently walks away clean because prosecutors across 3 administrations looked at all that evidence and decided it wasn't sufficient. But sufficient for what? If the standard is absolute proof beyond any shadow of doubt that would guarantee conviction at trial, then sure, maybe the evidence didn't meet that incredibly high bar for some of these individuals. But that's not the only standard that matters. There's also the question of whether the investigation was as thorough as it should have been, whether every lead was followed, whether intelligence files were fully examined, whether victims were treated with the dignity and respect they deserved, whether the public was given an honest accounting of what happened and why certain decisions were made. On all of those measures, what Massie exposed suggests massive failures. Victims are sidelined while influencers get attention. Documents exist but haven't been reviewed by key officials. Intelligence files may or may not exist and may or may not have been examined. Prosecutors made decisions, but those decisions are spread across so many offices and years that accountability is impossible. And through it all, we're supposed to just accept that nothing more could have been done, that this is as good as justice gets, that powerful people named in FBI documents get to go on with their lives because bureaucratic processes and prosecutorial discretion and jurisdictional complexities somehow add up to no one being charged. That's not justice. That's not how the system is supposed to work, and Americans of all political persuasions should be demanding better. This isn't about conspiracy theories or wild speculation. This is about documented victims naming documented perpetrators in documented FBI files, and somehow none of that leading anywhere. This is about an FBI director attending media events, but not reviewing the actual evidence at the heart of the case. This is about intelligence connections that may have led to Epstein being protected when he should have been prosecuted decades earlier. Massie's questioning was important precisely because it wasn't sensational. He didn't yell or grandstand or make unfounded accusations. He methodically presented documents, asked specific questions, and exposed the gaps in the official narrative. He forced Patel to either confirm uncomfortable facts or admit to not knowing things he should know. And in doing so, he showed why public trust has collapsed around this issue. It's not because people are irrational or obsessed with scandal. It's because the official explanations don't make sense when you actually examine them closely. When a congressman can stand up and describe 20 individuals identified in FBI files by victims, when he can name at least one of them publicly, when he can point to 100,000 pages of documents and ask why none of it led to additional prosecutions, and the best answer he gets is that prosecutors in different offices at different times decided not to charge anyone, that's a system failure. That's not justice working as intended. That's justice being deliberately obscured behind layers of bureaucracy that make accountability impossible. And that's why this moment in the hearing matters, not because it revealed smoking gun evidence that will lead to immediate arrests, but because it showed the American people, in clear terms, exactly how the game is played, how responsibility gets diffused, how questions get dodged, how victims get marginalized, how powerful people stay protected. Massie forced those dynamics into the open where everyone could see them, and once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to trusting that the system is doing everything possible when you've just watched an FBI director admit he hasn't even personally reviewed the key documents in the case. The fight for accountability in the Epstein case isn't over. Cases like this, where powerful interests are implicated and institutional failures are widespread, don't get resolved in a single hearing or with a single document release. They require sustained pressure, continued oversight, and refusal to accept inadequate answers. Massie demonstrated what that looks like. Not bombast, but precision. Not accusations, but questions that force officials to either provide real answers or reveal that they don't have them. That's the kind of oversight that matters, and it's exactly what we need more of if there's any hope of getting to the truth about what happened, who was involved, and why so many powerful people seem to have escaped consequences for participating in or enabling one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in modern history.